Hi everyone. Welcome to our August meeting. My name is John Mello. I'm one of the co-founders of Philadelphia PowerShell User Group. The two founders, Lito and TJ, could not make it today. Today we're very happy to have Timothy Warner giving us a presentation on Windows PowerShell DSC implementation tips. Timothy is a PowerShell enthusiast, IT pro, tech trainer, and author who is versed not only in Windows but Linux and OS X as well. You can actually follow him on Twitter and visit his website for a list of his training courses, speaking appearances, and the books he's written. You can also check out the courses he teaches at pluralsight.com. If you check our blog, we'll have links to all those sites. And from there, Timothy, I'm going to hand it over to you, unless you have anything else you want me to mention beforehand.
No, sir. That's great, John. Thanks a lot. Well, yes. Hello, everybody. And I appreciate you inviting me to be with you virtually here. I am a full-time trainer with Pluralsight, and like John said, and I've been an IT pro since 1997 and a Windows specialist throughout pretty much that entire time. And my relationship with PowerShell is almost by default. At Pluralsight, my manager is Don Jones, and one of my colleagues is Jason Helmick. And if you've heard those names, I can't help but just be steeped in PowerShell, and I think that's a good thing. Very briefly, I absolutely love your city. I come from Syracuse, New York myself, and there's actually three things I like about Philly. Of course, this. Second, disco. My 6-year-old daughter and I absolutely adore disco. And the third, I absolutely love the Philadelphia accent. It's my favorite. So what are we going to do in the next hour or so? I figured that we would set the stage for our discussion, level set, you know, all that good stuff. It's on me as your instructor to challenge you, regardless of whether you know a little about DSC, whether you know a fair amount, or if you're already an expert. I broke the presentation into focus areas, and you'll understand what that means shortly as we go along. I wanted this presentation really to be almost a living document for you. I'm going to give you a download link where you can snag this file as well as PowerShell script files that relate to this. Because I know, being a student, an attendee, as well as a teacher and speaker, that it can be distracting and annoying to be, trying to take notes and try to take everything in. There's really no need for that unless you want to. So I'll provide you with takeaways, and then that's it. Speaking of which, the session materials, I guess if you're going to write anything down, write down this URL. It's timw.info/PhillyPoSH, and that will result in a zip file. I think it's about 15 megabytes or so. Most of that space is occupied by the slide deck. And this slide deck is filled with some useful resources and links. Like I said, I'm hoping that it's going to be a valuable asset for you beyond just this hour that we're together. I'll give you this URL at the end of the presentation as well. And John, definitely, if any questions come up, please stop me right in my tracks and ask, okay?
Will do.
I like to quote this from Isaac Newton. He said, supposedly, if I've seen further, it's only by standing on the shoulders of giants. And that's exactly how I feel, like I said earlier. When I was preparing this for you, I consulted with a number of my friends that you see here. All these guys are really central in the PowerShell community. And so essentially what I've done is gather their best practices for DSC implementation and synthesized them. I guess this ties to my earlier comment on disco. That's really my skill in IT. I like to gather data, synthesize it, and then present it. So that's what we're going to do. Now, the timing of this presentation is a little bit suspect because from what I understand, the PowerShell team's got some big news coming up for DSC. If you've used DSC with WMF4, the so-called DSC v1, that really was quite a mess across the board. In WMF5, we have the DSC v2, and even that has so many quirks, idiosyncrasies, and pain points, especially when it comes to pull servers. If you're using Azure, it seems that the Azure team has a better grasp on things. If you've used their automation DSC service, that works pretty well even now. I'm not an MVP myself, so I'm not under NDA, but at the same time, even my friends who are MVPs are bound by their NDAs, so they couldn't give me specifics. But from what I gather, The PowerShell team is on the brink of making some big announcements concerning DSC and the pull server. So just keep that in mind as we go throughout the rest of this presentation. The problem in a nutshell, what is it? Configuration drift. And I don't want to read to you, I'll just try to summarize. You probably know what this is and have experienced the pain behind it. Especially now in 2016, we have all of these buzzwords that actually some businesses are actually practicing, right? Stuff like DevOps and continuous integration and continuous delivery. This rapid change with software and hardware combined with an ineffective change management process can result in configuration drift, or your servers falling out of compliance or the configuration that you need them to be in production. And again, I'm probably preaching to the proverbial choir here, but some of the problems that come about from configuration drifts are high availability and disaster recovery failures. My family and I took a trip to Florida a couple weeks ago, and I spent more time than I want to admit looking at Twitter when Southwest Airlines had their huge meltdown. Were any of you, if I were there personally, I would ask you, were any of you caught in that travel nightmare of just being trapped in an airport? I mean, horrendous. And I don't think there's much detail as far as specifically what happened, other than they said that their high availability and disaster recovery failed across the board. Their backups failed and everything. I mean, who knows? If your business is subject to audits and you have industry compliance, governmental compliance, those failures can be really costly. Just from a boots-on-the-ground systems administrator standpoint, reduced performance and reduced security, reduced availability can have impacts, again, financial impacts, service level agreement stuff, or let's face it, impacts with your job. I wonder what happened at Southwest in their IT department, for instance. And then, of course, there's the high cost of manual labor. Isn't that a big reason why PowerShell is a big deal nowadays? The ability to automate repetitive tasks and take away the human error aspect. That, I think, is a large part of what DSC is looking at. So, solution. Configuration management. This is definitely a buzzword that you may be sick of hearing. Systematic control of hardware and software changes. That's about the briefest definition you can imagine. I want to just briefly review how DSC works because, like I said earlier, I don't want to assume and can't assume what your skill level is right now. When John and I were talking about this session, he mentioned an intermediate level of content. So I'm going to try to shoot for the middle as much as possible. Again, any questions? If I say anything that doesn't make sense or if it spurs your curiosity, just go right ahead and ask. Ultimately, DSC taps into the Common Information Model, or SIM. This is an open standard, you may know. The Distributed Management Task Force developed it, and it defines managed hardware and software components. It's certainly not specific to Microsoft. SIM repositories exist on Linux, Unix, OS X. And the definitions for the hardware and software components on a system are in a universal format called MOF, Managed Object Format. Common point of confusion, I think, among some sysadmins is Windows Management Instrumentation, which is just simply Microsoft's flavor or implementation of SIM. It's important to note that there's only one repository on a Windows machine. It's not like there's a SIM repository and a WMI repo. It's the same repo, the same underlying data format. It's just that in PowerShell we have separate commands, sadly, to deal with the WMI versus SIM. And the best practice, you may already know this, is to rely on the SIM commandlets if for no other reason that they support the WinRM and PowerShell remoting, where you can hit multiple target machines in parallel rather than the old serial. The get WMI object just does serial, one machine at a time. And there's other advantages as well. To get more comfortable with SIM and WMI, if you're not already, this is a pretty cool project. You see the link in the upper right corner. This is a free and open source desktop app called WMI Explorer. I've gotten a lot of good use out of it. As you can see, you can tap into namespaces, into WMI SIM classes and instances and properties, and it'll actually build WMI query language queries for you right on the fly there. This is a really nice tool for education and even production use. Okay, this is the money really. This is DSC, my attempt to put it on a single slide so we're all on the same page. Desired state configuration, introduced with the Windows Management Framework v4, or so-called PowerShell v4, revamped in v5, and as I mentioned earlier, supposedly ready for another big jump with it. The goal of DSC configurations is producing a file that's in that managed object format file that's understandable by SIM, okay? And although it's de facto that we normally use Windows PowerShell in the configuration block to create these configuration scripts, we don't have to. Supposedly, I haven't seen any tooling yet. In fact, Jeff Hicks and I were just talking about this about an hour ago, that there's no tooling that either one of us know of that makes the process of creating a moth file any easier. I mean, if you're comfortable with writing PowerShell functions, then maybe writing configuration scripts is already no big deal to you. But the idea is that third parties can create tools. It doesn't matter. You can use moth syntax directly if you want to create a moth. The roads all lead to the same thing. The bits on the engine, that is the part of the Windows Management Framework that makes DSC work, the actual underlying engine of DSC is the Local Configuration Manager, also called LCM, and that's going to be running on any server or desktop that has WMF4 or WMF5. We're also going to need to have DSC resources available on every node in your DSC implementation. This is going to be, as you see in the upper left, I'm working from an administrative PC, and my target node may be a server down the hall or in another data center or in the cloud. It doesn't really matter, but in order to speak the same language, so to speak, we have to have the same resources available on those boxes, and that is its own implementation issue when you're dealing with different versions of DSC resources, okay? Now, how do we create the moth? Like I said, using Windows PowerShell is an easy way to create the moth file, and then you deliver the moth file normally with the start DSC configuration commandlet, either in a push environment, and that push can be a remote push like you're seeing here from my admin PC to the target node, or for that matter, you can start the configuration from the local host. It doesn't have to be from across the network, but that is generally what I see is how most people start to get into DSC, and I think that's a good idea to reduce complexity, especially on the front end of things. In talking to those PowerShell MVPs and developing this presentation, that was something that just about all of them said. Don't dive into the deep end of the pool initially. Instead, focus on the simplest use cases, in particular, writing quality configuration scripts, and we'll have more to say about that in a little bit. The pull server is what you ultimately want to get to, especially when you begin working at scale. In a dev test environment, when you just have a couple nodes, push is fine. But if you're dealing with racks and racks of servers, potentially data centers of servers, it's a different story. As you may or may not know, the pull server has a variety of deployment mechanisms. We're talking about, for instance, setting up an IIS-based web server that stores those moth files, stores those configurations, and then sends them down to the targets. There's a client-server relationship between the target node and its pull server. If you're wondering how does the target node know where it's supposed to go to get the configuration, that is specified in the LCM, or the Local Configuration Manager. Nowadays, I've found an increased amount of traffic or discussion about security with these moth files. Again, we'll have more to say about that as we go on. The use of HTTPS for your web-based pull server as opposed to HTTP, using certificates to encrypt credentials instead of exposing them in the moth files in plain text. Some opt for a server message block or SMB-based file share pull server. And those who have embraced Microsoft Azure Public Cloud, DSC is available there, and there's even a cloud-based DSC service called Azure Automation DSC. So there's definitely a lot of moving parts to this. Any questions coming up regarding this foundation or background information?
No questions so far.
All right. The DSC resources, I guess if the local configuration manager is the engine, we could look at resources as the fuel, I guess, the building blocks of a DSC configuration. What's cool about DSC is that because it's open source and because it's in the community, you can find resources to manage just about any aspect of Windows Server. And of course, there's the core built-in resources. And then there's community ones for SQL Server and SharePoint Server and Active Directory and network configuration. It's pretty amazing, the robustness. And of course, you're always free to develop your own resources if you want to use DSC to standardize and protect maybe line of business apps for which there's not currently a resource. A resource is ultimately a PowerShell module, and they follow pretty much all of those rules. Another rule, pretty much, I say pretty much, all this is provisional, subject to change, is that each machine can have only one configuration active at a time. Now, there is something called partial configurations, but again, the guys I consulted for this presentation suggest at this point, just pretend those don't exist now. The built-in resources that come with WMF4 and 5 are pretty bread and butter. I think there's like between 9 and 12 that allow you to hit services and environment variables, the file system registry, and so on. And then if you go out to PowerShell Gallery, that's where we can search for ones that meet your needs, your line of business needs. You'll notice that the built-in resources just have plain names, like registry. When you go to PowerShell Gallery, you'll find a lot of X resources. The naming convention, it's not enforced, it's just strongly suggested, is that when Microsoft releases, I guess, beta, for lack of a better term, non-production released, or let me say non-supported. I guess that's really from the PowerShell team's perspective. It's whether they will support you or not. Those resources are all prefixed with X. And even as of this recording, this session, all of the mainline ones on the PowerShell Gallery still are marked with an X. The suggestion is that if you want to create your own resource and put it up on the PowerShell Gallery for the world to download, to prefix those with a C. Again, the idea is just as a quick sanity check to not just blindly download and install these resources, but take a look. Is it X? Okay, maybe there's more into this as far as testing and validation than a C resource. I guess that's the general idea. The screenshot you see at right, I'm creating a variable that packs the registry resource, and then I look at its properties property, and this allows you to see what you can specify within a resource. And the registry resource, as I'm sure you know logically, allows you to force the creation or presence or absence of specific registry keys and values. So you can see the first two properties are key and value. So using PowerShell in this way as a discovery tool can be helpful, as is going to the PowerShell Gallery. Speaking of which, find DSC resources. Again, this has been a point of confusion over the last year. Where the heck do you go? It seems that the official ones from the PowerShell team are all now at PowerShellGallery.com. And if you have WMF4 or 5 installed, you have the package management and PowerShell get modules, which allow you to do a find module on these elements. You do like a find. In fact, let me bring over my ISE window. You do something like find module, and then you could search by tag, because that's something else that they have going on in the PowerShell Gallery, taxonomic tags. And, you know, again, in the name of continuous delivery, is this going to gather every single resource module? No, but it's at least going to give you the main ones. And then, of course, get module, save module, and so on and so forth. Again, as a trainer, I sometimes worry about under-teaching or over-teaching. I'm just doing the best I can here. I'll give you my contact information at the end, so if you want to reach out to me one-on-one, by all means. So yeah, there's an example. Install module, name, X SharePoint. The confusion, I think, with these DSC resources came in initially because the PowerShell team started releasing these resource kits, and they went through like 1 through 9, and then they bundled all of them together. I mean, it was really a mess for a while. I think now things have settled down. Looks like what they're doing is at github.com, this is where the source code for those resources exists. What you're looking at right now is the DSC resources repo that the PowerShell team owns. And essentially what they are shortcuts or symbolic links to separate repos for each resource. But at least this is the repo where you can see them all in one shot. And if you're familiar with Git version control, I hope that you are. Or if you're not, I hope that it's on your to-do list, because I know as an IT pro myself, I've always historically considered myself a hobbyist programmer. Getting more into PowerShell, you almost have to learn foundations of programming. And nowadays, even more with this DevOps push, where IT pros and programmers are supposedly on the same page in delivering product. I think learning Git is really important. And in a nutshell, if you don't know what GitHub is, it's a cloud-based Git repository, and you can fork, say, the PowerShell repository to your GitHub account, and then you can clone or download your copy of the repository to your system, and then you can actually work on this stuff yourself. I mean, on one hand, Microsoft, it's amazing that they've embraced open source so much. I mean, again, I've been in the industry since NT, so there was a time not too long ago where it was inconceivable that there'd be Linux integration and open source. So I think that's beautiful, but I also suspect that there's some cost savings, that the PowerShell team realizes that this rabid community, of which I'm a happy member, will make changes, bug fixes, submit those back to the team as pull requests, and hey, the Microsoft team saves on labor, don't they? So anyway, enough on that. Another resource, the URL's in the upper right. This is Don Jones and Steve Murawski's book. Free open source resource, excellent foundation that'll take you from beginner to, I think, early advanced as far as skill level goes. So you can't beat the price at being free. Okay, let's get into some of these focus areas, these specifics that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. First that came out in my discussion with the MVPs was wrap DSC in another tool. And at first blush, you might be thinking, Tim, are you suggesting not to use DSC? And no, not exactly. First of all, remember that desired state configuration is a configuration management engine. And this is Evel Knievel's SkyCycle. I've been absolutely obsessed with Knievel lately. I hope some of you are as well. Well, the late Knievel. Jeffrey Snover is the founder of PowerShell, the father of PowerShell, whatever you want to say. This is an important tweet that he put out a year or so ago. Asking, should I use Chef or PowerShell DSC is like asking, should I use Word or the printer driver? And at first blush, you might scratch your head and be like, huh? But I think this is super wise. PowerShell DSC is really the engine, or like a printer driver is. And then a full featured configuration management platform like Chef would be like the entire application, like Word. You see what I mean? So PowerShell DSC actually fits in nicely with full-fledged solutions, because let's face it, if you've put some miles on DSC, I can almost guarantee what some of your pain points are. Lack of reporting being one, difficulty in troubleshooting being another. And you've got tools that are out there that have a full solution with tooling, with reporting and auditing and troubleshooting, and even support, all wrapped around them. So this slide just introduces you to 6. There's CF Engine, there's Chef, there's Puppet, there's Vagrant, Ansible, SaltStack. These are major players. There are others, of course. Most of these, if not all of them, had their start in open source, and still, for the most part, they are mainly Linux, Unix, and to an extent OS X. But I really think that Chef stands out. And let me just say, as a matter of clarity, I have no relationship with Chef Software other than I'm friends with Steve Murawski, who's one of their tech evangelists or tech leads or something. I suggest them and call them out as an example because I've seen them work in industry and I've seen their involvement in the marketplace, okay? Now, evidently, Chef, the Chef Core server is a free product, but you pay a license for the full tool set. And I know a lot of people in industry who are doing good work with Windows-based configuration management with Chef, and as it happens, Chef integrates with DSC very tightly. Another thing that's cool is that Chef, they show up at conferences. They were at the PowerShell and DevOps Global Summit last year in Washington. That's something you don't see a lot of the other config management platforms do. So they're consciously partnering with Microsoft. So from my perspective as a Microsoft specialist, that means a lot to me. So Chef can actually make use of DSC resources in their so-called cookbooks, their runbooks. The tool already has reporting and auditing and tooling and so on, like I already said. It's also integrated natively in the Azure portal. So it's just an example of a configuration platform that can ride on top of and integrate inside of DSC. And there's a good video that explains the integration. If you go to YouTube and look this title up, I forgot to put the link in, but it's called Automating Windows PowerShell DSC with Chef. So I just present that for your consideration. Oh, I guess I did include the link. timw.info/chefdsc. Okay, I mentioned this earlier too. The focus on writing quality configuration scripts and understanding what you're doing there. There's some pitfalls and best practices that we can discuss. Number one, understand the structure of resources. I'm not saying get down to the MOF, the Managed Object Format level. That's really not necessary. But go to the GitHub site for a resource and dive in and look at the various parts and pieces. One in particular that's generally considered a good reference resource to study is X networking, because that one is just, I mean, it's so central to system configuration. After all, when you're thinking of setting a TCP/IP configuration, that's a deployment option that you're going to use for every system practically. So it's very actively developed and has been written according to community best practices. So for instance, you can pop open an elevated PowerShell console, do a find module to find it, as I said before. There's a save module commandlet that allows you to download the resource to your computer but not install it, you see. If you actually want to install it, that's install module. And when you do that, as you can see, I've integrated demos into the slide deck here to save time. I've downloaded the X networking resource and opened it up. Now, it's probably too small to see on your screen, but in the Explorer window here, it's 2.10.00. It's important that if you can use WMF5, do so, because WMF5 supports module versioning, where you can have multiple versions of modules on the same system. That can be a handy thing. All the modules, the resource modules, as you see, look pretty much like most other PowerShell modules that you've worked with. It's important to know that these X modules actually contain, in most cases, a number of specific resources. So X networking is the name of the resource module, and then inside there you have a number of specific resources. And these are the actual components that wind up going into our configuration scripts. And again, the text is small on your screen probably, but you see there's firewall, there's IP address, there's NetBIOS, there's network teaming. And those should be pretty self-explanatory if you've done network configuration before. Going further, we use start DSC configuration and then path out to the MOF file that you've created with a configuration script. A commandlet that I thought was great when I didn't know it even existed for a long time. When you're testing a DSC configuration, there's the question, well, how do I lift the configuration off the system? I want to remove it. I made a mistake. Remove DSC configuration document, sets the stage parameter to current, and that will effectively lift any currently applied configuration from the target system. Going into that previous Explorer window I had on the previous slide, if you go into the examples folder, these X resources are nicely documented. In many cases, you don't have to create configuration scripts from scratch. You can simply pluck or harvest code from the examples that you see, okay? And there I've got one opened up in the Visual Studio Code Editor. You'll notice that for an IntelliSense-enabled IDE like Visual Studio Code or the PowerShell ISE, that you get squiggle lines if that resource isn't on your system. So that's something to keep in mind. When I first got into DSC, I thought I had to download all of the resources. And that was back in the days when the PowerShell team was doing the resource kit 1, 2, 3, and all that nonsense. No, really, you just need the resources that you need for your configurations. That might strike you as a Captain Obvious comment, but at one time it wasn't at all for me. I thought you just had to have them all. Best practice, use source control if you're not already doing it. After all, you may not be the only administrator in your business. You may have to work not only with other sysadmins, but other developers in this. I mentioned earlier that Git is a good version control system. Your business may already, and your developers principally, may already be married to another one. But I personally like Git for a couple reasons. One, it's what a lot of Microsoft product teams use, so there's instant integration there. And two, it's a distributed version control system, which means that each developer has a full read-write copy of any repository on their system. And there's no real master. I guess if you're using GitHub, you'd use the GitHub repo as your ultimate master branch. But every developer, you don't have to worry so much about check-in and check-out like with centralized systems like Team Foundation Server. Yeah, so why consider source control? You may, even if you're the only developer in your shop, you might think it's silly to keep your DSC configuration stored in a Git tracked folder, but I don't think so. I think maintainability is really important here. The ability to roll back to a previous version of a configuration script, awfully useful to do. If you're merging changes from other developers and something blows up, it's nice to be able to, again, to roll back. It doesn't have to be as complicated as you think. I've talked to a lot of sysadmins who are nervous or unwilling to embrace source control because they think, oh, that's too developer-y a topic. That's too much of a programmer-y topic. I mean, I look at it this way. I've been a writer for almost as long as I've been in IT. It's natural. It's as natural as breathing for me to use the revision tracking feature in Word, for instance. Why not the same thing with our Windows PowerShell scripts? Speaking of which, another front-end best practice, if you're not using Pester, please try to get on board with that as quickly as you can. This brings in the idea of test-driven development. Unit testing would be testing at the function level to make sure when you make a change, for instance, it doesn't break the use case of your PowerShell functions. And this goes for your DSC configuration scripts as well. Test-driven development's a big buzzword this year, where the goal is to have 100% of your code, again, DSC configuration scripts included, covered with unit tests. A superset of this is called behavior-driven development, or BDD. If you're not sick of TLAs or three-letter acronyms, just hang on and you'll probably feel your gorge rise before too long. But at any rate, BDD is sort of an architecture or a methodology for testing, such that you can write your tests in such a way that you don't have to tweak them every time the underlying function or code changes. You see what I mean? And I say all that because Pester is a BDD framework. It's taking huge currency. I mean, Microsoft has adopted it. It's just about every full-time PowerShell scripter I know is adopting it. The guy behind it is a guy named Dave Wyatt. You'll notice that I've put Twitter handles in to this slideshow. So if you're not following these people, I would suggest that you do so. Now, I don't know much about this. Have any of you heard of Test Kitchen? Steve Morosky told me about this morning. I wish I had more notice. I didn't even know this existed. But it's an integration tool that employs Pester. It works with DSC. I don't know much more than that, just to be perfectly blunt with you. But it's an automation testing framework. So if you're buying into this idea of BDD, of behavior test-driven development, this is a framework that you might want to take a look at. It originated as sort of a spin-off of Chef, but the developers behind this project, and it is a GitHub-based free and open source project, they've relaxed and released dependencies on Chef, so you should be able to use it independently of any chef, okay? And the public website is kitchen.ci. If nothing else, I just wanted to run this by you so you're aware of it. Another automation release framework that you see a lot is called AppVeyor, A-P-P-V-E-Y-O-R.
Hey, Tim.
And I'm not...
Hey, Tim, sorry
Yes.
to interject. Actually, Steve Morawski was just on Run As Radio this week discussing Test Kitchen. So if anyone's interested in that, just listen to the latest episode about Run As Radio, and he goes into detail about that.
Thank you very much for mentioning that. Yes, indeed. And I listened to that, a little, some of it anywhere this morning. And Steve, you should do a search really on Google for Steve Test Kitchen, and he has a page that he put up that has a links list, and one of the links is his Run As Radio, and another to a blog post written by another guy whose name I can't remember, that does a really good job of breaking down what Test Kitchen is in non-developer language. So anyway, scripting best practices. Well, that could be and should be another session unto itself. This slide, I just want to buzz through it quickly. They're just hyperlinks to a curated list of what I thought were the highest impact listing of scripting best practices. And these are good best practices just in any PowerShell scripting, but are certainly all relevant to writing DSC configuration scripts as well. And then Ed Wilson's book from Microsoft Press over there as well. I guess another reference. Steve, I keep mentioning Steve. He's pretty key to this, I guess. He and a really smart guy named Michael Green, who's a Microsoft employee, put together a white paper called the Release Pipeline Model. And I suggest you take a look at this because they do a great job of making a case for testing, for source control, for continuous integration. I mean, these are buzzwords that can quickly become meaningless. But both these guys are really good teachers, so they do a good job of explaining what those concepts might mean to you, and ultimately what those concepts mean with configuration management and your work with desired state configuration. Not only is there the white paper, but I know Michael did several talks on this subject. If you go to YouTube and look up Michael Green, you should find some good presentations he's done where he expands on this. All right, how are we doing for time? Okay, good. Next focus, the LCM. Remember that the local configuration manager is the engine, the underlying engine that actually allows a Windows system to apply a MOF-based configuration. What you need to know for today about LCM, if you don't already know, is that there's two approaches. There's the WMF4 approach and the WMF5 approach. Now, you can use the WMF4 approach that I have on this slide with WMF5, but the reverse is not true. And that should make sense. I mean, imagine trying to open a Word 2002 document in Word 2016. That would work. But then open up a Word 2016 docx file in Word 2000. You know what I'm saying? This is what I grew up doing, if you don't mind the corny expression. In your configuration creation script, you can tweak the local configuration properties in line just by adding a separate block called Local Configuration Manager. This is where you, for instance, if you're going to do a pull server, you specify that. The text might be too small for you to read details, but you see a property refresh mode equals pull, refresh frequency minutes equals 90, so every 90 minutes it's going to check with the pull server to see if there's an updated configuration at the server. And, you know, there's the issue of HTTPS and credentials and blah, blah, blah. Pull server, again, is an entirely different subject unto itself because there's so many annoying moving parts with it. But this is what I'm just saying. The ability to do a local configuration manager block in a larger configuration script. If you've done this, you know that when you run the configuration script in the ISE or whatever you're using, you wind up with one or more MOF files for each target node. You might just be doing a test where you're running against the local host. There you'd get a localhost.mof. And then if you have a local configuration manager block, you'll have a localhost.meta.mof. So there'll be a separate MOF file that specifically does the LCM configuration. In WMF5, you can still do the old way of doing it here. And but the WMF5 best practice suggestion is to do your LCM tweaking in an entirely separate configuration script and make use of the DSC Local Configuration Manager attribute that you see up on the top in the square brackets. So this is the simplest possible code snippet you can imagine. But the top of the script has the attribute declaration, and then you actually name the configuration for whatever you're doing. LCM config would work. And you have your node possibilities, and then in the settings area, or the settings block, that's where you can use those same properties to specify push or pull, whether you're doing apply and monitor or apply only, all of that kind of the tweaky stuff. For both of these methods, you can do a one-off configuration of an LCM by using set DSC Local Configuration Manager. So start DSC configuration is what you do to push a configuration MOF to one or more hosts. Set DSC Local Configuration Manager is a way to push just LCM configuration to a host. I hope that I explained that in some semblance of sense. The reason why this doesn't work in WMF4 is simply a language issue. That WMF4 doesn't understand that DSC Local Configuration Manager attribute. Whether that's going to change going forward, who the heck knows? Tread lightly with pull server. This was a somewhat surprising best practice I received as I was preparing this presentation for you. Now check this out. If you haven't watched this video, this is a video called What's Up with the DSC Pull Server. It's hosted by the PowerShell org group. And Mark Gray is the speaker. He's pretty much the cat herder of the PowerShell team. He's the senior program manager. And this was a super surprising presentation for me because he seemed so pessimistic about DSC in general and DSC Pull Server in particular. He discusses the pain points of the Pull Server in great detail about versioning problems, about credential management and credential encryption. It's an enlightening 51-minute presentation, and if it were just left like this, you might come away depressed. But like I said at the beginning of the presentation, I don't have any details to share, sadly, but I do want to put the bird in your ear that supposedly Pull Server is going to be a heck of a lot more intuitive to use in the near future. How do we protect credentials in DSC configurations? You might know that, and it's just totally Captain Obvious, that many DSC configuration tasks require administrative credentials. So you may have a call to get credential in your configuration script, and then when you run the script to create the MOF, you get the Windows Security dialog and you provide the administrative credentials securely, you think. But if you ever looked at the resulting MOF file, you'd be super disappointed to see that the credentials are there in plain text, including the password. Now, the way that normally what I've seen administrators do is that they'll make use of the configuration data construct that you see on this slide, where we define a variable. The variable can be called anything. Here it's called configuration data. The variable is what's called a hash table, or a key value pair, or a key value array, that has two pieces. It has all nodes being the key, and then a series, potentially a series of hash tables as values. So it's a hash table of hash tables. In this particular example, we're targeting 3 separate nodes individually. And we can set PS DSC allowed plaintext password to true to allow plaintext passwords to be stored in the MOF file. I mean, that's maybe okay for test and dev, but you've got a serious vulnerability in that your MOF files have exposed credentials. How comfortable are you with that? The preferred approach as of today is to use digital certificates, X.509C certificates, that will encrypt the credentials at rest. As you know, with encryption, we're concerned about protecting sensitive data both in transit and in rest. The way to do it in transit, of course, is to use the HTTPS pull server. And the way to encrypt the credentials in your MOF files at rest is to use certificates. Again, that's another subject that the specifics are beyond our scope. But know that you don't have to buy a public certificate from GoDaddy or whomever. You can certainly use Active Directory certificate services to construct an internal public key infrastructure, or PKI. If you really just want to cheat, you could use makecert.exe or the Internet Service Manager GUI tool to create self-signed certificates, but I guess that's better than nothing. But as you see here in this example, we're binding an actual SIR format certificate and the certificate's thumbprint into our DSC configuration script. And the net result of doing this would be the server's certificate, not a user certificate, is that you're able to protect the credentials that you pass into the configuration. You would still presumably have a parameter that calls get credential, or you create a variable that uses the PS credential data type. And so when you run the configuration script to create your MOFs, you would still input the administrative credentials, but at least in the MOF source files, you'd have obfuscated, if you don't mind the $5 word, or munged, or gobbledygook instead of sensitive passwords. I was chatting with Jeff Hicks earlier this afternoon about, well, what about totally automating it so you never have to put in credentials in the first place? And his response is, well, he didn't have a good response. So I guess that's another rough edge. Boy, if I were there in person, I would ask you, those of you who are doing DSC, especially in a pull server configuration, what are you doing to protect raw credentials in your MOF files? Actually, does anybody have any insight that they want to share now? And John, could you repeat if somebody says something?
Sure. Does anyone do anything right now? No, I don't think everyone's doing. So you guys notice nobody doing pushing, or just no one doing credentials?
I'm doing credentials, but I have had a debate about where the certificate really should go. Should it go on the target node? Does it go in the authoring box?
Right.
I haven't really come up with a good answer for that yet. So.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I heard that reply. I'm not sure there is a good answer yet to that, unfortunately. I think this is the last focus area, write quality DSC resources. Now, this is a special use case because it assumes the need for you to create your own resource. Of course, the best case would be that you find exactly what you need at the PowerShell gallery. Let's say that you want to use DSC to control the deployment and existence of a SharePoint farm. Think of all the moving parts that go into that. We have computer management and IP addresses and host names. We have Active Directory, domain membership, and server roles. We have the SharePoint bits themselves. We have IIS configuration. We have SQL Server into the mix. I mean, it just goes on from there, doesn't it? And that's a good example because I think SharePoint's pretty well covered as far as DSC resources are concerned. But what if you want to use DSC to protect an implementation of, say, Salesforce.com? I don't know off the top of my head if there's community resources for that particular product, but you're eventually going to probably run into the case where you don't have a resource already created. So the DSC resource source code at GitHub, I already showed you that. There's the PowerShell team blog that has guidance. Of these links that I have on the slide, this is probably the best one. I believe it's Katie Keim, who's a pretty darn active member of the PowerShell team, who heads this up. But this is a really nice checklist of DSC resource design gotchas, pitfalls, and best practices. And I like the approach that she used on this. She will describe each element or each suggestion and then give a bad and a good example, sort of like if you've looked at a grammar guide for just language, English language, oftentimes there'll be a bad example and a good example. Another is, it's a resource itself, but it's a resource module called the Resource Designer tool. that I haven't used this myself, so I can't speak at depth about it, but supposedly it's a way for you to create templates to make it easier to build resources. And remember that the resource in turn is going to be consumed by your DSC configuration, which in turn turns into a MOF that's in turn ingested by a target node. And Bob's your uncle, as they say. So that's really it. I want to pause now before I give you my contact info and that URL where you can download this stuff for questions, comments, concerns, curiosities. What do you have on your side for me?
Anyone else have any questions? I don't have questions this time, Tim.
Okay, all right, cool. That could be, being an instructor, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. I'll be optimistic and say it's a good thing.
Sure. Actually, hold on. Actually, we do have a question, if you don't mind.
Okay, sure.
I noticed when the LCM changed from WMF4 to WF5, the field that specifies the MOF file you pull down, the new field is called config names, if I remember right. And that used to be just a string in WMF4. But in WMF5, it's actually an array of strings in the object on the LCM. And I'm kind of curious, the rules that the documentation has said is there's still only one configuration for every single target LCM.
Yeah.
But it's an array. So what happens when you actually fill that in with multiple names? And maybe that's a underlying piece of framework that they've put in there for probably maybe a future version. Or I'm just kind of curious what that's all about. I may not use the right terminology.
I think I'm understanding you. Like in this slide, for instance, are you talking about this here, node localhost, the ability to create an LCM configuration for multiple machines, such that when you run the script, it's going to spit out MOF files for each machine, right?
Right. And when you set under the settings section, of course, there's refresh mode. One of the other things you can set is a config names. And that in LCM version 5, that's what kind of references the MOF file and tells the pull server which MOF file it's supposed to pull down. And when you're actually on what is that?
Okay.
Or maybe I've got the name wrong.
I'll find out. The short answer, I don't know myself, but, and this is an important but, I can get an answer trivially easily. So I think what I'll do, I could probably get the answer tomorrow morning. John, how about I send you the answer I get regarding this?
Sure.
And then would you propagate it to the rest of the group?
Sure. We'll put it either in a blog post or send it out tweet-wise.
I get my purpose with all of this is GPOs are very easy to layer on top of one another, and one at the lowest level takes precedence and is applied last and all that. That's very frustrating with DSC at the moment. Maybe there's something coming soon that will help that out. Maybe, maybe not.
Pointing to a new feature. Okay, good. I think I've sufficiently documented your question that I can, and maybe it'll be a non-answer answer. I'm curious to know, but be on the lookout from the update from John about that.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Whoops.
All right, I think it's the only question we have, Tim.
Okay. I don't know on this slide, I don't know if the HTTPS will work, so keep that in mind. But you can download this slide deck that has all the links and guts, as well as a bunch of sample DSC scripts that Jason Helmick created that you might find useful. For instance, he's got examples of different ways to do credentials and certificates and so on in those. So I'd say it's a worthwhile download. My website, you can reach me at timwarnertech.com. My Twitter is TechTrainerTim. So I would say between those links, if you want to reach me, it should be easy to do. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with you on there. So that's it. I want to thank you again for for hosting me today. It was a pleasure on my end, and I sure hope that this gave you some ideas and some inspiration on your side.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. You're welcome. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
You too. So just to follow up on what Tim was talking about, has anyone seen the DSC book that Don Jones is working on? Yeah. So the cool part, the cool part about that is he's going to make it sort of like I'm not sure how many of you guys do Office 365 work at all, but Tony Redman and a few other people have been doing an Office 365 book in a similar situation where they update it almost monthly, whatever changes in Office 365. I think they do it almost like a yearly basis where you buy it for the year and it'll almost every month change it with any updates to Office 365. So Don's doing the same thing with a DSC book he's writing on LeanPub. The price just went up on Monday. It was originally like $39.99. I think right now it's like $54.99. I think within a few more weeks it's going to go to $80 once he's done finishing it. I think that'll be the final price of it when it actually is considered like feature complete and in a strictly updating phase. And he's committed to keeping it up to date almost through the life of DSC. At least he mentioned he was, and I have no reason not to believe him considering how invested he is in the PowerShell ecosystem anyway. So anyone looking to get a DSC, I highly recommend you grabbing it. I purchased my copy last week. Funny enough, I think actually he mentioned that only so far 100 people have bought it. I forget where he mentioned it. He mentions it in his blog post that he's noticed, like just from the money he's got so far, at least 100 people have bought it. So definitely check that out if you're looking to definitely get a little more about DSC, especially one of the experts, because Dom was like right on top of that when that first came out and did there's also a free DSC book on PowerShell.org. I'm not sure how recently that's been updated. I know when PowerShell version 4 first came out, I started looking at that.
Pull it out again.
Oh, okay. So you had the PowerShell.org book?
Yeah, I don't remember when I got this at a tech ed, so I'm gonna say 14.
Yeah, I think 2014 was right around when it came out, actually. So yeah, definitely check that out.